Well, I think it's important to understand that the situation in Catalonia is very different to the situation in Gibraltar. First of all, I mean, a lot of your viewers will be used to hearing discussions of self-determination in a Gibraltar context. And this is effectively a right to decolonization that's enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations and in various resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly, especially the famous Resolution 1514 of 1960. In which the right to self-determination of colonial peoples really crystallizes. Now, the right that the Catalan Independentists are asking for is a right to break away from an existing state. And that's not something that international law has very much to say about. This is an internal question in Spain, and it's to be resolved from a legal perspective according to the Spanish constitutional order. Now, that's a very restrictive way of looking at it, because really there are much broader political and moral questions to consider in the context of the Catalan referendum. And you may have seen that there was a report recently that 400 professors of international law have signed a letter saying that the Catalan independence movement has no grounding in international law, which is kind of a statement of the obvious. International law might have something to say after a point where Catalonia maybe makes a declaration of independence and then seeks to become independent on the international stage. And then the question of whether Catalonia then can become a state is partly a legal question as well as a political one. It will depend on whether sufficient members of the United Nations recognize Catalonia as a state. But at the point where we are now, I think it's just important to stress that the kind of right to self-determination that's being claimed in Catalonia is really a political right. It's different to the legal right of decolonization through self-determination that a colonial territory or non-self-governing territory like Gibraltar is entitled to on the international stage.
Okay, and so then if we reflect more generally on the sort of, if you like, question marks that certainly the PP government and much of mainstream media in Spain have placed on that referendum. Can you make any comment on what sort of, I mean, you more or less have in respect of international law, but insofar as the Spanish Constitution, and I mean, this is, I know that this is not your area, strictly speaking, of expertise, but from your standpoint, what sort of legal standing is there for the referendum?
Well, so within the Constitution of Spain, which is the 1978 Constitution, it's clear that that Constitution places an emphasis on the territorial integrity of Spain and the national unity of Spain. Now, there are some constitutions around the world that actually include a right of self-determination and a right of secession for peoples or nations within the state. So the Ethiopian Constitution, the Liechtenstein Constitution include provisions like this. It's very clear that the Spanish Constitution doesn't include a provision like this. And so it's clear then that as a matter of Spanish constitutional law, the Catalans have no right to break away from Spain. Again, this is quite a restrictive and legalistic way of looking at the problem, because really what we have here is a question of a distinctive population within Spain claiming a right to decide its own political future. Now, if Spain wants to behave like a democratic state, a state that owes its existence to the consensual will of the people that make up that state, then my personal opinion is that they need to show a bit more respect towards the Catalans who want a greater degree of autonomy or perhaps even want independence, and just allow for them to be able to express a view. Now, it may be that at some point they express this view and then a conversation has to be had about whether it's feasible for Catalonia to break away from Spain. But I think if you contrast it with the approach that Britain took in relation to Scotland, I think that was a much more mature approach. And it perhaps reflects the fact that Britain is a much more mature democracy than Spain is. The Spanish Constitution is 40 years old. To a large extent, it was a compromise which included many elements of continuity with the previous regime in Spain. And many of the people who are currently running Spain are, in fact, the descendants in political terms and to some extent even in biological terms of the people who were in charge during the Franco era. And I'm not merely talking about the political class, but also the people who are in charge of the banks, the church, and various aspects of the Spanish deep state. They're still the same kind of people who are around at that time. There's a paradox in the sense that Spain is a very decentralized state, but at the same time has a central government that takes quite an autocratic view of how the regions should be behaving and where they fit in to the overall constitutional order of Spain. And there's a tension there that really has to be resolved. And this is really a political question and not really a legal one. So to fall back on the argument that what the Catalan Independentists are trying to do is to breach the constitution of Spain, what they're doing is illegal. I mean, as I say, that's a legalistic approach. It's not strictly wrong, but it doesn't really get to the core of the issue, which is about respect and due regard for the rights of a population, of a people within the larger state of Spain that maybe wants to go in a different direction. They have a right to be heard and a right to be taken seriously. And I don't think that right, that political and moral right, is being taken seriously at the moment by the Spanish government.
So, I mean, you sit in, or you work in and live in Cambridge, which is a little bit further away from Barcelona. What sort of things are people in the international mix that no doubt Cambridge offers? What sort of thing are people saying about the way that the Spanish central government has tried to stop Sunday's vote from going ahead?
I think the overwhelming feeling in Britain, at least, is that the Spanish government is taking an excessively heavy-handed approach to this, and that actually, ironically, it's galvanizing support for independence, where probably there was no majority support for independence in Catalonia. The approach that the Spanish government is taking is just getting people's backs up in Catalonia, and I think that's the impression that people have in the UK. Certainly there was, in relation to the Scottish question, the approach was so different in relation to the Scottish question in the UK that people don't really understand why Spain, a democracy, a European democracy like Britain, should be taking this approach. But I think when you contextualize it and you consider that Spanish democracy is only a few decades old, democratic norms aren't as ingrained in Spain as they are in Britain. It's important to understand that the context is completely different and that we can expect the approach to be different. It's also, some people are looking at this also in the context of the very polarized nature of politics that's emerging now. It's partly, could be a social media effect. We're seeing it in America, we're seeing it in Britain, where positions become very polarized and people at opposite poles aren't really listening or respecting the people who take the opposite view. And the center of politics is being hollowed out. And so then to just translate this to the Catalan scene, what you have is some people who are very ardently now pro breaking away from Spain, and other people who are taking a completely opposite approach and saying that the Spanish state must remain solid and they'll send the tanks in if Catalonia tries to break away. I think between those two positions, a sensible debate could be had about the future of Catalonia within Spain. But the conversation is not really being had at the moment. And I think that might be symptomatic of the more general political climate that we're in at the moment, with very polarized views. But that's my personal opinion.
An interesting one at that. You spoke about the similarities and differences insofar as self-determination was concerned between Gibraltar and Catalonia. What about the role played by territorial integrity in this sort of in the broader picture?
Well, self-determination and territorial integrity are two sides of the same coin in this context. Now, the difference with the Gibraltar case and the Catalonia case is that while Spain might say that Gibraltar's future engages the territorial integrity of Spain in some way. It doesn't really as a matter of law, because the territorial integrity of Spain was breached in the early 18th century, as we know, and Spain gave Gibraltar away in 1713. And at that point, Gibraltar ceased to be part of Spain. So Gibraltar is an overseas territory of the United Kingdom, and it has a right to self-determination as a non-self-governing territory for whom the United Kingdom is the administering power. Now, the Catalan question is very different because Catalonia is part of the territory of Spain. And if Catalonia were to break away from Spain, this would result in a breach of Spanish territorial integrity. Now, that is not really a question that international law has very much to say about until such point as Catalonia makes a declaration of independence or tries to break away and establish itself as a state. And at that point, it will be seen whether the United Nations and sufficient states within the United Nations recognize Catalonia as a state, and whether it can go it alone as a matter of fact. So that's a political question. It's also a legal question. But it's a statement of the obvious that if Catalonia was to break away from Spain, then Spanish territory would be diminished to some extent. If Gibraltar were to become independent or exercise self-determination in some other way, there would be no breach of Spanish territorial integrity.